Thank you, Fliss, for this reintroduction, I guess, because it's the second one. And I'm sorry, this will be a thematic break from what you've heard before. But I guess that's part of the appeal of this conference, that there's so many different things you can listen to and learn about. I'm just starting share screen, so that's all work good. Well, so let's go for full screen as well. Okay, so there we are. Yeah, as I said, thanks so much, for having me yet again. And as I promised when you first saw me at this conference on Wednesday, I would use this talk today to talk about the more unexpected results of my PhD research I did at Durham. Research that looked at the role that heraldry played as a means of visual communication in cities in late medieval England and Germany. And sure enough, I found the townsmen, as well as their noble counterparts who went about their business in cities as well, of course, used heraldry to assert all sorts of things, to contest claims to status, possession, power. But what I did not expect was how often late medieval townspeople expressed such claims not by displaying coats of arms, but by preventing their display, either by sort of censoring them or by defacing them, or in fact by smashing them to pieces entirely. And there were plenty of potential targets, because the late medieval city was really, home to a great number of heraldic signs decorating the inside and outside of houses, halls, churches. They embellished gates, towers, and marketplaces, and they featured in urban rituals such as processions and pageants. Late medieval townspeople I found looking at texts related heraldry, including their families, their guilds, their cities' coats of arms, to quite important concepts of chivalry, morality, and antiquity, and perceived coats of arms in relation to notions of individual and collective honor, which is obviously very important in the medieval period. But precisely because coats of arms were so passionately cherished as these outward expressions of individual and collective identity, including this, sense of honor and status, their presence also gave rise to conflicts, and they provided an opportunity to oppose these claims to honor and status that was derived from it. Any other claims that, these coats of arms that have been put up might have been meant to imply by the people who put them up. Opposition and violence towards heraldry displayed, I will show, was used to criticize and challenge more or less powerful individuals, claims to power, religious practices, and the urban space as such. Today, I will focus on German cities, but you can read more about similar things happening in England and other parts of Europe, if you so wish. And to add some structure to today's sort of tasting menu of opposition and violence towards heraldry, I will break down the discussion on my talk into three different parts. The first part will deal with the use of such practices, destructive practices from above, as an official sanction imposed by emperors, kings, princes, but also urban bodies, governments. And the second part looks at cases where participants saw somewhat eye to eye and used coats of arms to conduct conflict. And the third part will then introduce one particular case in more detail, a little bit more detail, in which aggression towards heraldry might have come from below as an expression of popular protest. So let's start with from above, because kings and emperors took action against coats of arms of people that had sort of fallen from grace, and against undue claims implied by heraldry they might display. And the latter was the case for a German nobleman called John of Saxe-Lauenburg. John had, contrary to the emperor's decision, maintained his family's claim to provide Prince Elector of Saxony, a very important office, not least by sporting the coat of arms associated with the Prince Electorate of Saxony. And the emperor, let me tell you, was not amused, and ordered, quote, to have those arms and titles of Saxony removed wherever he, John, displayed them. And this order was actually put into action in Berlin, where Duke John had attached the arms of Saxony to his hostel, as you did, and wrote John of Saxony under them or beneath them. And then, as the emperor had commanded, these heraldic ambitions were soon challenged by other attendees of this event, who in line with the emperor's commands indeed did rip off, the sources tell us, the arms. But the arms of townspeople, burgesses, could suffer the same fate as the case of Jacob and Sigismund von Argun shows. The two brothers from Augsburg had fallen out with the emperor, as you did, over their support for an enemy of his, Louis VII of Bavaria, in 1462. And as a result, an imperial representative seized their possessions, foremost the family's house, and, quote, he sold all he could find, placing the arms of the emperor above that of the Argun family. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this was really just a gentle, covering of the Argun arms. So certainly this imperial measure against, two core elements of the Argun identity, their family home and their coat of arms, was answered rather destructively, because upon their return to Augsburg, the two brothers recaptured the house and again ripped off the arms of the emperor in a somewhat violently described manner. Urban bodies, so councils, guild governments too, threatened the use of likewise measures against coats of arms. And guilds in Cologne decreed around the turn of the 15th to the 16th century that overdue fees or fines may be enforced by covering the shields the coats of arms displayed in their members' hall. But destruction was really not the only way of making a point with coats of arms and about their bearers. Alternatives become visible in partly preemptive moves against heraldic display in the medieval city, which might be classed under the somewhat broad label of censorship, as I've sort of suggested, because if you have come across the matter of medieval sumptuary legislation at any point, you will not be so surprised to find that townspeople also thought about the political and moral implications of heraldry that could be seen in their city. And they did not even shy away from saying no to the heraldic display of rather powerful individuals. In June of 1411, for example, Sigismund of Luxembourg, one of the most powerful men in Germany at the time, had petitioned the city of Frankfurt to display the imperial arms of the German kings and emperors outside his residence during his temporary stay in the city. But the council refused outright, because they said if they were to allow the display of the arms in the city, this might cause the people of Frankfurt great misfortune and cause suspicion. And the reason for this decision might be that Sigismund was not actually yet king. Germans at the time elected their kings, that is, their prince electors did, one of whom we've seen earlier. And if a different candidate had been elected, not Sigismund, the council's permission to grant this display of the coat of arms, the imperial arms, by Sigismund might have been construed as, some sort of favoritism, which risked harming relations between the city and any other successfully elected king. In Nuremberg, so not too far away, we find similar things, but moral worries here, because the city is quite famous for its many heraldic memorial shields, which you can see in an exhibition at the moment. Very nice. But at the end of the 15th century, the urban government grew to dislike the presence of heraldry, or at least it sort of expands in the city's churches, and considerable concern over the moral implications, deeming them really sort of a costly vanity, and it was forbidden to engrave, affix, or paint any shields, signs, or plates inside the city churches above a certain value and without prior permission. So there's the political and moral component here at play. But as I said, eye to eye, people of similar status sometimes had similar problems, and similar to these forms of official punishment and legislation, coats of arms were also targeted by quarreling parties who saw somewhat eye to eye, because they were of similar status, noblemen and townspeople alike. But they also wanted to make, critical and attention-grabbing points about one another. So when Emperor Charles IV stayed in Passau and displayed again, the imperial eagle, the imperial arms outside his residence, that sign of the empire was erased with filth, as the sources tell us, by leashmen of his or a rival faction. And townsmen were not much better, really, because they acted similarly in urban quarrels. one of which I will talk about now. Removal and defacement of coats of arms come together in a move of the alderman of Worms, a German city, against the provost of the local cathedral chapter in 1487. Because in that year, records of the council tell us today, the provost had to build a new oriel on the city wall, which he had been permitted to do, but beneath the oriel, he also, quote, cut a hole in the wall and placed his arms therein, carved from a great stone with a lion's head. And that he had actually not been allowed to do at all, explicitly not. The council was not happy because I think having the provost's coat of arms attached to the wall, which often bore the city's coats of arms on the towers, they might have feared that this might actually suggest that the cathedral chapter, the provost, had possession of this part of the wall, something that the urban government really jealously reserved for itself. And as the provost failed to remove the arms himself, the city's aldermen eventually took care of the matter themselves. And as you can see here, after Vespers, allies of the council and the master builders, together with the city's craftsmen, went down to the wall, removed the stone, fixed the hole, and then dragged it outside the bailey onto the street. And their children got hold of the stone and hacked off the lion's head, and the stone remained there for a long time in this manner. This additional denigration or denigrating defacement is important. In fact, defacing arms, which was a much more emotive counterpoint than removing them entirely or preventing their display in the first place. And we can see that in a way, the next example, which is sort of the last one that I'll talk about, and it brings us to 3, what about popular protest? What about moves from below? I found, and I think it's a problem that a lot of historians and medievalists share in particular, it's really difficult to talk about anything, including heraldic practices, the further you climb down the social ladder. So I was quite pleased when I found that it is precisely in attacks on coats of arms that occasionally social groups that we don't normally know about appears acutely aware of this language of honor, what you want to call it, heraldry implied. And they were quite able to make points to the contrary. Charles the Bald, the Duke of Burgundy, had a great appetite for expanding his realm at the expense of his neighbors. And eventually this appetite reached Cologne, where a herald was ordered to put up the Duke's arms throughout the city. And as you can imagine, the townspeople were rather unsupportive of this claim to what they believed was their city after all. And so they expressed their opposition to this claim through an attack on the so presumptuously displayed arms. Because in the night, the Duke's arms were covered in filth and ripped off. And a 16th century chronicler, so actually 100 years after the event, has a little more to say about the identity of the culprits. Quote, "The ordinary people gathered in all places where the Duke's letters and arms had been put on display and hurled feces and other muck at them, ripped them off and dragged them through the dirt, shaming the proud prince as much as was possible." End of quote. And this episode really brings me to the conclusion of this paper, because even though, coats of arms might have been displayed in the medieval city to represent individuals and institutions, to convey the sense of identity, and to maybe, claim social status, political office, and even the urban space itself, all of which were sort of caught up in this identity. Onlookers were not necessarily in awe of such heraldically announced claims and not necessarily willingly accepted them at all. They could, and they did, reject them. And it is striking that in doing so, they also relied on heraldic communication, or visual communication, albeit in the sense of, demanding its absence, defacing it, destroying it, to express their discontent and their protest. Practices of censoring, defacing, and erasing heraldry, because they were perceived to evoke persons or institutions and claims that were somehow deemed objectionable, or because they were feared to undermine a cherished or desired status quo, served townspeople as well as, these noble knightly antagonists as weapons, really, in all of these social and political conflicts that affected and divided medieval urban societies. And attacks on heraldry were part of a late medieval visual culture, and they were part of this broader context of violence against visual matters, iconoclasm, if you will, in the widest sense. And it strikes me that the role of iconoclasm as a means of communication remains rather underexplored for the high and later Middle Ages, because this time is sort of lodged between the early medieval Byzantine image struggle and then, on the other hand, and the early modern Reformations. So this period actually has received not that much of attention, especially outside the field of religion. You might think of Lollards in England, Hussites in Bohemia, and Savonarola in Florence, who all defaced images. But apart from that, especially the political implications or occurrences are not that well known. And now, really, having said that, if you don't have any questions about this paper, in particular from me, I'd be most grateful if you had any input for this broader context of violence against visual matters, as I like to call it, in the Middle Ages. So thank you yet again for another audience at a CVAC summer school. Thank you so much.